Hello and welcome back to Current Conditions. I'm your host, Maggie Hitman, and it's been a little while. So it was always my intention to be a little bit more regular about this, but as you'll see as we go today into transits and revisit what was happening over the course of the summer, there were some things that could have been distracting, not only in my life, but in your life as well. So what I'd like to do today is a little foray back into the transits of the summer and a little bit of a forecast of New Year transits. You should know that I am doing regular write-ups on Substack, so I'll put that link below. So some of this I've already covered in some of this post, but this will give you some visual to maybe help understand what's been happening on the personal level and the more collective level. And the next episode, I'd like to revisit the subject from the last couple of videos, which was location and environment and the impact of those, both physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually, and to look at that from more the astrological perspective and how the 12 signs and the associated environments have their own influence, and we all have specific karma associated with those, and then we may get into locational astrology along with that. And simultaneously, I am working on a little collection of articles for Substack that I'll hopefully be publishing simultaneously with that video. So you may want to check that out. But for today, yes, we'll do a little review. We'll get back into the groove of the podcast experience, and hopefully it will be interesting to you. So I would say that the summer could be described as nothing less than inflammatory. When I look at the transits that began in June and went all the way really until the middle of September, there, of course, were positive things that happened also, but some of these transits were so hot and so sharp that it's likely for a lot of people there were sort of overwhelming factors in life that may have overshadowed even some of the beneficial things that were happening, at least at times. And we are out of a lot of that. We are out of really the intensity of what spanned about 3 months, almost 3.5 months of difficult transits. But I have noticed in speaking with clients that a certain amount of recovery time has been necessary for some of what happened, especially if you had significant placement, if you have significant natal placements in the places where these transits were happening, then it was more difficult for you as an individual to weather these storms, versus if you didn't, then it may have been more other people in your life having problems that impacted you. We'll look at this a little bit more specifically, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is today in my location. But what I'd like to do is go back to the day when Mars entered Leo in transit. So this was June 6th. So we'll just go right back there, simplify this a little bit. All right. So you can see, so this is the South Indian chart, and you can see that the signs in this chart are fixed, just for anyone who doesn't really know what's happening here, in case it's interesting or helpful. The signs don't move in the South Indian chart, and so this is always Aries, this is always Taurus, this is always Gemini, this is always Cancer, this is always Leo, all the way around to Pisces. And so the planets will move around in the signs, but the signs are fixed. So here we're looking at Mars was in Cancer. This was June. So on June 6th, actually Mars made the transition from Cancer to Leo. And that gap between Cancer and Leo, that space is called Gandanta. It's actually a difficult placement anyway for planets to be moving through. But Mars in this case is coming out of debilitation and then coming into Leo to join the lunar node K2. And so what's going to happen here is that it's not just Mars and Leo. You can see the blue planets are the transit planets. So we're now moving from June beyond to see what's happening. So Mars is here until it was July 28th that Mars moved out of Leo. But for the duration of that transit, Mars was with K2 in Leo. And so both of those planets are actually well placed in Leo. They're fire planets in a fire sign, and overall they would be pretty happy there. But when Mars and K2 get together, they create a very hot, sharp combination that can be like borderline explosive. It is associated with, like if this placement is in specific parts of a natal chart, it can make someone work with electricity or use sharp instruments in their profession. On an internal level, it tends to bring this explosivity emotionally. And so we did, I think, see quite a bit of that during that time in the collective sphere. So this was during a time of more violence in the Russia-Ukraine situation. It was also when the 12-day war happened. And so there was actually there was an uptick in military conflict and involvement across the world during that time. And then you may have noticed on a more personal internal level, like that's what we call the temper tantrum combination in colloquially in Vedic astrology. That Mars K2 can cause these like anger outbursts for whoever it's impacting. So if it's in a natal chart, for example, in the 4th house, and that's the place of the mother and early family life, and there could have been a lot of that in someone's upbringing, and someone's mother could express that kind of like really unpredictable anger outbursts. So to have this happening for everyone, in the transit chart, and really strong too, because Mars and K2 are both strong in Leo, that was really a period of quite a bit of instability. It's also, Mars K2 is it's a little bit accident prone, so you have to be a little careful during those times. And then what happened after that is Mars moved so there was kind of this period of maybe feeling like, oh, there might be some relief, but what happened was that Mars moved into direct opposition with Saturn from July 28th. So immediately after the Leo transit, from July 28th until September 13th. And so Mars-Saturn opposition does generate tension. They're basically very unfriendly planets with almost completely opposing energy. So Mars is very proactive, aggressive, assertive, can be impulsive. It's a very hot energy that tends to act quickly and in a very directed manner. And Saturn is a very slow planet that is actually kind of difficult to instigate and usually demands patience and limitation, restriction from us. And they move at very different paces, and their operating modes are of very different qualities. And so when they're in opposition or when they're together in a chart, they just tend to generate a lot of tension, almost like this sort of like impossible situations energy, like between a rock and a hard place. This sort of can be Mars-Saturn energy. And this was amplified by the fact that Saturn was retrograde, and also Rahu is and has been aspecting Pisces as well. Rahu is the second house drishti. It's actually a 12th house drishti in reverse, but basically, functionally speaking, it's a second house aspect. And so this sign of Pisces in general was very tense during that time. And if you have any significant natal placements in Pisces, also those were getting extremely stressed. Especially moon placement in Pisces is going to be really hard. Sun placement also, Lagna in Pisces. Anything that is there was getting basically hammered from every angle. And so, like I said, it tends to present these sort of like very difficult, almost impossible situations. It's not great for health either, especially if the moon is in that axis or other planets that you already have issues with health-wise. That was going to be a challenging time period. And during the Mars-Saturn opposition, anything in Virgo also was going to be very challenged. So if you're someone with a significant amount of planets in that axis, that would have been a turbulent time. And so we can celebrate the fact that that is no longer happening. I think also it was made more vulnerable by the fact that that spring March series of planets piling into Pisces followed by an eclipse already sort of sensitized that sign. And from my perspective and what I've seen with clients, created this sort of overwhelm situation where there's just so much that needs to be done, and it can be so overwhelming that it's hard to do anything at all. And that kind of pressurized that situation anymore. And then the fact that Saturn was still retrograde at that time, slowing everything down, it just created sort of a difficult situation. And this was happening also during the time when in the northern hemisphere it was also summer, and so it was just hot outside in a lot of places too, and so that's going to aggravate Pitta naturally. And then that Mars K2 combination is aggravating Pitta as well. So I did see a lot of people with heat problems, Pitta type problems, and so since then, the season itself has helped calm a lot of things down that way. And now the transits also are not quite so intense, although I will say that right now there is a Mars-Saturn influence happening, but it's not quite as direct. So Mars is aspecting Saturn and Saturn is aspecting Mars. So that is creating a certain amount of pressure, but it's not the same as a opposition. So we should be aware, though, that this Mars and Saturn will be conjunct at some point here. Starting April 2nd, Mars will be, you can see here with the blue planets showing the transit planets, in conjunction with Saturn. And for a time, the sun will be there too. So that will be hard on all things solar. And that goes until May 11th. But that will still be tricky as long as Mars is in Aries, because there's what's called a papakartari on Pisces with two malefics flanking that sign. So it will be as if Saturn, Rahu, and Mars are all in Pisces together. And that's a pretty significant kind of blockage energy. Rahu, Mars create Agni Stambhana, which is it tends to block initiatives, and Saturn will be there also creating other sorts of problems. Like Saturn, Rahu together are a windstorm combination, and then Saturn, Mars are a Yama Yoga. So that altogether, that will probably be a time when a lot of discipline is required to sort of keep everything in order there. We can talk more about that as that gets closer. But for the time being, I want to look a little bit at what's happening around the new year, since we're basically there, and what you can expect in the near future. Okay, so what we have recently experienced is this. So this is Scorpio. This pile up of planets in Scorpio. I think at one point there were 5 planets in Scorpio. Is gradually unwinding. And when there's a lot of planets in Scorpio, things can feel a little stuck. So what's happening now is that all of these planets are starting to gradually move into Sagittarius, that should be a good thing, because that stuck energy should start to be able to circulate and move on. Scorpio is just a place where things get stuck, particularly emotions, but anything in there is trying to work harder to get things moving, and there's a proclivity to get kind of like a little bit too deep or dig a little bit too deep or get kind of stuck in a hole. It's a great sign for research, or if you're into occult studies and things that really require you to dig really deep and go down rabbit holes. But if you're trying to just have a comfortable experience and get things moving forward, it can be a little tricky to have a pileup happening there. So things moving into Sagittarius, that's nice for having a little bit more drive and dynamism and inspiration, and feel like you're maybe a little bit more aligned with what you need to be doing. It's just to pay attention to the dates, the specific dates when planets are getting up to the edge of Scorpio, getting ready to move into Sagittarius. Those can be a little bit tenuous, in the same way that planets moving from Cancer to Leo can be a little bit tenuous, because this is another Gandanta placement here, where it's a point of tension, one of 3 points of tension in the zodiac, where when planets cross those positions, they feel unstable. Usually there's some sense of insecurity and internal tension that's generated there, usually because of unknowns. But those are dates to pay attention to. I do mention those in the Substack posts, the specific days that those planets are transiting, so that you can kind of take care around those days. Especially Mars transiting Gandanta, you don't want to take physical risks, because Mars can be really accident prone on those days. So you can see that soon, when a planet enters about 27 degrees of the 30 degrees that composes one sign, it's kind of starting to be on the edge of that sign. And the Gandanta will go then into about the first 3 degrees of Sagittarius. But the 1 degree on either side is the most tricky. So if we look at Sun's transit here, we have Sun in Scorpio, and then you see Sun at 0 degrees of Sagittarius in just a couple days. So that's when we'll get the month of Sun in Sagittarius, and then gradually these other planets will also come out of Scorpio. So Venus will transit on the 19th and Mercury on the 28th. So then what we'll be seeing is actually a pileup of the planets in Sagittarius. So this is, you can expect to see, I think, more drive in general in people, instead of this kind of frustrated, fermenting, stuck energy. It's a little bit more driven towards accomplishments and goals. And Sagittarius is really highly connected with morality and your internal belief systems. So there can be a little bit more of a focus on those things during that time going into the new year. So if we go to January, that's what's happening. There's actually quite a bit of stability. Mercury will be unstable, but that's not a big issue. Moon will be Gandanta on the 1st itself, in case this is important to you. It's a little, I think what you're seeing here is the alcohol consumption. Moon Saturn is social drinking, actually. And so in a natal chart, this can bring alcoholism related to social drinking. So you're just seeing the high proportion of people in the population consuming alcohol, because this will have been on the 31st too. Moon will still be in Pisces. And then, then there is kind of a newness associated with this energy once Moon gets into Aries and crosses that Gandanta. There's still, anyway, some issues. Everyone's not maybe feeling great from all the alcohol consumption the night before, but from the Vedic perspective, New Year's Day, January 1st, is not that significant for like setting the tone for the whole year, because their Vedic New Year is not happening until the Sun enters Aries, which is not going to be until the spring. So if we look at that becomes a much more significant date. So in April, mid-April, when the Sun is exalted in Aries, that's officially the beginning of the Vedic New Year. So, but for our purposes, if we just want to see how things are going, I would say in general, it's not super tense like the summer was or anything like that. So I think that's fine. Things to be aware of early in the new year. Some of this I'll go more into detail with in writing, but just to take note that there will be eclipses in February, and anyone who's been listening for a little while knows that those are really significant events and times to take a lot of care and follow a certain protocol if you get into that sort of thing. So this will be February 16th is the solar eclipse, and the lunar eclipse will be in March. And there's so many details to know about with not only the signs that they're taking place in, but whether the solar eclipse follows the lunar eclipse or the lunar eclipse follows the solar eclipse, and what other planets are involved and where that falls in your chart. And there's a whole way of making, huge life predictions just based on eclipses. And I think for just now, knowing that these are not ideal times to start things, especially before eclipses, and things in the middle of eclipse cycles can get a little tricky. If you wait after a lunar eclipse, if you wait 3 days after a lunar eclipse to start things, that's actually a nice window, because there is this energy of purification that happens with the luminaries going through this kind of pressurized time of going into shadow and coming out of it. And so it is considered a time when you kind of can have the wind at your back if you're starting things. So if you have major projects or businesses that you're opening, anything really of significance that you want to be enduring or to have good results, then you'd want to wait in like early March would be a nice time period. And it's not that you can't do anything now, but I would, that 10 days before a solar eclipse, so that window is really going to start around the 6th of February. I would avoid starting anything major or important during that time period. And then it is also good to just kind of take everything with a grain of salt, things that are happening socially or even internally. I think that's what can be so valuable about following these transits. And there's so much information here, but there's just different energies with each day, depending on transits and even the phase of the moon. It can be helpful for understanding when to take yourself seriously and when to kind of just let things pass over. Because a lot of times if you're able to do that, especially on difficult days, then things are changing anyway. So there maybe wasn't a need act, in a particularly negative time period. And then there are ways to use those more difficult time periods productively too. Like the eclipses can be really good spiritual opportunities. They're great times for meditation and taking on spiritual practices, and in some cases, getting rid of things or fasting. Those sorts of things, they can really amplify positive effects. So, more on that to come, but that gives you a little bit of a lay of the land of the Western New Year anyway, and will maybe help you digest some of the experiences of the summer. And next time, we'll get back into kind of some of the bread and butter of what is, I think, the most interesting stuff for me to talk about. And we'll return to transits again as well. But I'd like to discuss some of a little bit more about the zodiac, which I think will be helpful. Even if you don't know much about astrology or Vedic astrology, I think that stuff will make sense to you. So look forward to that, and see you next time.